when they've sold this deal in the past, there's always been domestic concerns that it's paying a lot of money when people feel in the UK as though they have cost of living issues. And why are we spending this much money to give something away? And the point has been US security and the US want us to do that. If you can't say that's the case, what is your argument for something that's already politically divisive and politically unpopular potentially? So he can push on, but I think it is really hard to really, in the long term, do that if you don't have administration support.
Donald Trump's pulled his support for Keir Starmer's plan to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The UK's been trying to lease the Diego Garcia Air Force Base on a 99-year deal from the government of Mauritius, which was agreed in 2024. But in a social media post last night, the US president criticised the plan, saying it panders to the forces of wokeism. It's not the first time he said this, and the president has been known to change his mind once or twice. Joining me now is Katy Balls, the Times and Sunday Times' Washington editor. Good evening or good morning, Katy.
Oh, I think good afternoon. It's the one you missed, but thank you.
We almost got there. So, Katy, you've written a fantastic insight analysis piece for the Times today about why Donald Trump changed his mind on this, because it's been quite a long, drawn-out lobbying process. Tell our listeners what's been going on and what led to that Truth Social post last night.
So I think there's lots of factors at play, not least our Times colleague Oliver Wright, he's brought fresh details today in terms of a disagreement behind the scenes, frustration at the UK side about potentially the UK not letting the US use RFA bases for potential strikes on Iran. So that's one developing story. But I think the bigger picture is we've had a situation whereby ever since Keir Starmer agreed this Chagos Islands deal, there's been two narratives. You'll speak to figures who on the British government side, and they'll say one of the biggest things in favour of the deal, which there were political concerns sounded bad to voters because it's paying billions to give away territory to then lease it back to Mauritius. They would say, well, Americans support this and the administration supports it. Then you would speak to opposition politicians, whether in the Tory party, Reform, and they would say, no, we have figures that we know in the administration, they say this deal is terrible and they don't like it. And there's always been those two competing narratives. Last year, Donald Trump appeared to be with the officials when he was asked about this when Keir Starmer was in the Oval Office. But I think it's been quite a complicated picture where opposition politicians have kept lobbying. You've had some on the US side saying, this deal is not perfect, but it secures what everyone can agree is a really important military base. And from the UK perspective, one of the key things that the UK offers the US in terms of that security partnership is one of the things that we bring to the table. And I think one of the things that's happened is Donald Trump has learnt more and more about the deal. And also, you had the Biden administration being pro the deal, but one of the arguments for this deal is ultimately they're worried about international law, UN courts saying the UK doesn't have a right to it. But this is a president who made pretty clear earlier this year he doesn't really have much time for international law. And then you add to that the situation in Iran, which I think is really focusing minds on how this is such a strategically important military base. And it's all coming together, along with unhappiness with some things the UK government is doing, to mean that you got that pretty explosive Truth Social, which I do think is hard to walk back from.
It does feel, Katy, as if this is now the president firmly against the Chagos deal, that we saw his press secretary, Karen Levitt, come out saying the president's word is final until the president sometimes comes out with a different word. But I'm very interested in the role of UK politicians here, and you write about this in your piece, that we've had the likes of Reform UK's Nigel Farage. He's said to have lobbied the president. Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, said to have lobbied the president. She popped up with a picture of them at the weekend. But also the figure I didn't see coming on this is Sir Ian Duncan Smith, who was the former Conservative leader and Work and Pension Secretary, and he seems to have played a role in it. So it looks as if there's been a concerted campaign from the right of UK politics to bend the president's mind. If you were to pick which one of those was most influential, who would it be?
I'm not trying to dodge the question. I just think that all three have had an impact. And when you speak to US officials and figures in the State Department and the political appointees on this, there have been lots of people who have thought on the American side this is a really bad deal, but they haven't been sure where the president is. And also you've had lobbying efforts by the British government to try and bring them on side. And you will speak to figures in DC and they will say, look, the president is the commander in chief, but are some people getting to him? And therefore, I think it's been a cumulative effort, if we're being honest. I mentioned all three figures that you mentioned in my article because Ian Duncan Smith, for example, has been very visible in DC in recent weeks. We know he has been bringing this up when he's been having meetings on various issues. But Nigel Farage also has been speaking to his friends within the administration this week. He also dined with Scott Besson in Davos, and it came up then. And then you have Liz Truss, and I've heard people on the US side say that they think that she might have had an impact on it too. So I think if enough people bring something up, you start to pay more attention to it. And there was a point, if you think a few weeks ago, and I think this is why Oliver Wright's story is really important too, which is when Donald Trump has brought up issues with the Chagos Islands, it has tended to speak to unhappiness with something else the UK government has done. So, for example, Greenland was when around the time he did his first True Social criticising the Chagos Islands deal. And there was a feeling on the US side that, the UK was being critical of his desire to take Greenland. And they thought, well, they decided that was hypocritical, and also it was unhelpful. And they also wanted to perhaps change the subject from the terror threat. Here, there's obviously disagreement also going on about international law, Iran, that's a backdrop. But Donald Trump is also someone on any issue where people say the last person he's spoken to often is, does influence his opinion and means that it steers him. It's why Marco Rubio, partly as national security advisor, but he splits his time between the State Department and the White House. Proximity is key in this administration, and power runs through the White House. So having conversations with the president or his team and capturing his mind and him asking questions is obviously a really key part here. And I think all three that you've mentioned have had a role there.
The question now, Katy, of course, is what does Keir Starmer do? That the bill that would put the Chagos deal into law has been paused in the House of Lords today, while the Prime Minister has a bit of thinking time, even though I think it looks pretty clear as this thing might be dead. I mean, is there any world where Keir Starmer does anything but having to junk this? Because, the President's made it clear, and it feels to me quite difficult for the Prime Minister to still push ahead with it.
Well, diplomats are saying conversations are ongoing. They're trying to keep those channels open and obviously speak to the US administration. And obviously, Donald Trump has changed his mind before. I'm sure he'll change his mind again. But I do think how specific, how in-depth his announcement is, does make it really tricky. And I think the question Keir Starmer has to answer now is, what is this deal for? Because when they've sold this deal in the past, there's always been domestic concerns that it's paying a lot of money when people feel in the UK as though they have cost of living issues. And it's, why are we spending this much money to give something away? And the point has been US security, and the US want us to do that. If you can't say that's the case, what is your argument for something that's already politically divisive and politically unpopular potentially? So he can push on, but I think it is really hard to really, in the long term, do that if you don't have administration support.
Well, thank you very much. That's really interesting stuff there. And you should check out Katy's piece, which is on the Times Online, and of course her regular column in the Sunday Times, which gives you the expert Washington insider view. That was Katy Balls, the Times and Sunday Times Washington editor.